invitation. I'm very happy to be here, and I will take this opportunity for self-promotion because yes, the volume was published 2 days ago, and we managed to have an open access ebook next to paperback, which means that anyone interested is able to download it and read and take a look, and I really invite you to do so because we have really wonderful authors, mainly historians, but I think they give interesting perspective on the issue of Jewish cultural property. And having said that, I want to also stress that now we are moving a little bit from the legal and practical perspective and going into this early period in hope that I will be able to show you a tiny fraction of what actually happened with Jewish cultural property after the war, because I think it's crucial also to understand what is happening now. Let's make it start. In the past 3 decades, the fate of Jewish cultural property during and after World War II has attracted increasing attention in both popular and academic literature. However, this vast body of scholarship, if growing relatively fast, has resulted so far in only a partial picture characterized by a double imbalance. First, while the multiple restitution initiatives in Western Europe have been by now rather thoroughly examined, the countries of the former Eastern Bloc seem still heavily under-researched. Second, even those few scholars who dealt insofar with Nazi-looted libraries and archives, and this will be the focus of my lecture, and with regard to Czechoslovakia, one has to mention at least Dovzhidovsky, if advised from the Israeli context, Patricia Kennedy Greenstead from the American one. So they looked at the matter first and foremost through the lenses of either Israeli or American, or to some extent also British sources, such as the Archives of Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, Jewish Trust Corporation, EVO, the National Library of Israel, which are the most commonly known depositories of primary materials in the field. While providing many interesting insights into engagement of these institutions in the salvage of Jewish books, these sources create very particular perspective on the cultural restitution in Eastern Europe, which is too often reduced to the notion of supposedly all-encompassing nationalization by the state. While reflecting quite well an external, one may say Western, perception of the political developments in the Soviet sphere of influence, this perspective is rather obscuring with regard to the very complex circumstances that shaped the fate of Jewish cultural property and may hardly be described with only one notion. Thus, complementing the international sources with various local material, my paper focuses today precisely on this overlooked context and seeks to examine a variety of practices, all, let's say, beyond restitution and nationalization, that were implemented with regard to Jewish and particularly German Jewish libraries and archives in Czechoslovakia between 45 and 48, which means prior to the communist coup d'etat and the introduction of the major nationalization laws. But before diving into the main presentation, I would like to give you some background, and we'll talk briefly about the Jewish cultural property in Czechoslovakia during the war. So during World War II, the fate of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia was both similar to and different from other Nazi-occupied countries. As everywhere else, also the Jewish population of the Protectorate suffered from the hands of the Nazis and their collaborators. In 6 dreadful years, more than 250,000 of Czechoslovak Jews were murdered and their property plundered by the occupiers. But on the other hand, unlike the other countries, Czechoslovakia became at the same time a peculiar center for the relics of Jewish culture, especially archives and libraries, that had been gathered in 3 main locations. The first was the Central Jewish Museum in Prague, established in 1942 under the Nazi administration by the members of the local Jewish community. Led by the former community librarian Tobias Jakobowicz, the museum was responsible for processing the property of the abolished communities in the Protectorate. It also received donations from people awaiting deportation, as well as the assets collected by the so-called Treuhandstelle that managed the property left behind by the deportees. Over the period of its activity, until the beginning of 1945, the museum catalogued some 46,000 books, mainly from the communities of Bohemia and Moravia, but also from the collection of the Reich Association of Jews in Germany that were sent to Protectorate. The second location for the looted books was a concentration camp in Theresienstadt, where two libraries with vast collections of Judaica and Hebraica operated also from 1942. The first one, known as the Central Library, was founded on the collections of the Rabbinical Seminary in Berlin and the private library of the Warburg family of Hamburg. These holdings were shortly expanded by books brought to the camp by prisoners, as well as by collections of German Jewish organizations, Masonic lodges, and other forbidden literature that had been shipped to the camp from Germany. Until the liberation, through several departments of the library passed some 200,000 volumes. The second library in the camp was closed to the public and consisted mainly of Hebraica and Judaica sent to Theresienstadt by the Reich Main Security Office in Berlin, and I hope that I not have to introduce this institution, one of the major plunderers of the Jewish property. So this library held some of the most important German Jewish book collections, such as libraries of the Jewish Theological Seminary of Breslau and the Higher Institute for Jewish Studies in Berlin. A larger part of the Jewish collections of the Reich Main Security Office was evacuated from Berlin in 1943 to several castles in Sudetenland due to the Allied bombing of German capital. Here, of special significance is the castle of Nimes, now Mimoň, near Reichenberg, respectively Liberec, that received more than 250,000 Nazi-looted volumes stemming from various Jewish communities and institutions in both Western and Eastern Europe. Thus, upon the liberation, in Czechoslovakia there was a shattered and decimated Jewish community, but vast amounts of Jewish books and archives. All of the Nazi-looted property that was to be found in Czechoslovakia in the end of the war was subject to a new legal framework created by the post-war government. Strongly connected to the retributive policy against the German minority, the new regulations established the so-called national administration over the property of the enemy states, including traitors and other unreliable persons, as well as over the assets that had been plundered or Aryanized by the occupiers. Importantly, the libraries came under both categories. Simultaneously, the government administered a long chain of bodies responsible for the property. So beyond relevant ministries involved each in their respective areas of interest, the National Land Fund took control over the rural properties, whereas the urban properties were transferred under the jurisdiction of the Fund for National Renewal. Finally, the preparation of general plans for the distribution of the asset fell with the remit of the Settlement Office. Then, with regard to libraries specifically, the National and University Library in Prague was appointed to take care of the books and literary estates that were being transferred under the national administration. In the field, the property was handled by the local authorities that were entrusted with the power to return them to their previous owners or successors, provided they produce proofs for their legal titles and successfully undergo the rehabilitation process, proving their loyalty to Czechoslovakia. As envisioned in the regulations, mainly the unrestored property was supposed to be confiscated by the state. However, this multi-layered theory translated into a very difficult practice. In fact, the restitution path created by multiple legal regulations that came into force between 1945 and 1948 made the status of the Nazi-looted Jewish cultural property very obscure, and the whole process of its restitution only more chaotic and unpredictable. Rather, the Jewish claimants, both domestic and foreign, were often stuck in between different ministries, commissions, and administrative bodies granting contradictory decisions. But of course, these legal obscurities surrounding the Jewish books and archives did not prevent many institutions and agents to look for the acquisition, once the news about the abundance of Jewish collections spread in and outside Czechoslovakia. The first body to inquire about the books was the Jewish representation in the immediate surroundings, which means the Jewish Museum in Prague, re-established in May 1945 by Hanna Woławkowa, who worked in the museum during the war. In the first post-war months, Woławkowa and her small team not only took over the collections that remained in the museum, but also sought to transfer to their care the libraries held in Theresienstadt. Even though the museum had no legal subjectivity at the time, Woławkowa managed to receive the permission to move the books to Prague due to the support of the Prague Jewish community and the Council of the Jewish Communities in Bohemia, Moravia and Silesia, which were officially recognized as representatives of Jewish survivors. Eventually, in autumn 1945, some 100,000 books from the Theresienstadt collections were moved to Prague. However, neither the museum nor the community or the council were granted the ownership rights to these collections. They acted rather as custodians or state administrators. Even though the vast majority of the books were deposited in the museum's hands, they could not decide their fate without consulting the authorities. If not an obstacle for the potential usage on the spot, this proved as a long-standing challenge for many that sought to regain the books over the next 2 years, including rejected inquiries that were made, for example, by the Royal Library in Copenhagen in October 1945, the Council for the Protection of the Rights and Interests of Jews from Germany, based in London in February 1946, and the Commission on European Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, based in New York in August 1946. However, quite different was the case of books from the Wartime Museum, which were offered for sale as soon as May 1946, following the visit of the representatives of Joint, who were looking for religious and educational materials for the Jewish inmates of DP camps in the American zone of Germany. At the end of the negotiations, successfully concluded by the summer of 1947, the museum sold to Germany some 85,000 books, including 34,000 German Judaica, 40,000 literary works, and 10,000 school books. The acquisition did not raise objections from the government because it was officially presented as sale of the holdings that already belonged to the museum. Yet the exact origins of the books were not explicitly given at any point of the transaction. Furthermore, as one may learn from Hage Adler, who participated in the selection of books before his emigration to London, the whole process was executed in a way that made it impossible to trace their provenance, and I quote, "It is just a matter of luck, if and what one may find there in the magazines of the Jewish Museum, because one cannot sort the books in a systematic way. What has already been and is still being lost is a true symbol of our increasingly barbaric time. Here, one has to take care of everything lumped together and has the embarrassing feeling that if guiltless, one takes part in a destructive world." Toward the end of this paper, I will come back to the effects of the various book transfers, but now I would like to mention one other example of acquisition, this time by a private bookseller. In November 1946, first contacts were made between the museum and Shmuel Warman, a co-founder of the famous Bamberger und Warman antiquarian bookstore in Jerusalem that specialized in rare Judaica and Hebraica. Following the war, Warman set off to Europe to find some German Jewish literature for his clients in Palestine. The archives of the Jewish Museum reveal that he acquired Nazi-looted books in Prague at least twice, first in March 1947, when he exchanged some of his holdings for more than 1,000 volumes from the identifiable collections, and second in the spring of 1949, when he bought more than 3,000 books of his choice from the Theresienstadt collections. The major foreign recipient of the books from Theresienstadt camp was the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, even though it was neither the first nor the most prominent institutions interested in their acquisition. However, the university was probably the most diligent and resourceful party in the process, and managed to establish very close relations with the Jewish Museum, what proved critical when the negotiations came to a deadlock. Between 1946 and 48, the university had 4 different emissaries in Prague, including such renowned scholars as Gershom Scholem and Hugo Bergman, who were supposed to convince the Jewish survivors and the Czechoslovak authorities to grant the university the trusteeship over the German Jewish collections from Theresienstadt and the Sudetenland castles. The emissaries won the approval of the Jewish institutions relatively easy, but the negotiations with the Czechoslovak government proved much more difficult. In the end of the lengthy and tedious process that definitely deserves a separate lecture, the emissaries were allowed to take some 40,000 books only from the Sudetenland castles. For the additional 16,000 volumes from Theresienstadt that included some rare Hebrew manuscripts, the government demanded a fee of 1 million Czech crowns. The university did not agree with the demand and resorted to rather unusual procedure. It was decided to secretly replace the crates containing books from the castles with the most valuable volumes from the camp. The replacement was performed by the last emissary, Zev Shek, and with the help of the museum's librarian, Otto Muneles. The books were then dispatched in 2 consignments, the first in April and the second in September of 1948. The last foreign transfer that I would like to mention today was orchestrated not by the Jewish institutions, but by the Czechoslovak authorities, and covered the books from the Sudetenland castles. As opposite to the libraries in Theresienstadt, Sudetenland collections were discovered by the authorities long before the Jewish parties even came to know about their existence. The castle Mimon, which was the most important depot in terms of Jewish holdings, became the focal point of interest for the National Library, Ministry of Education and Ministry of Foreign Affairs as soon as early autumn 1945. More or less at that time, the state officials began the identification process of the looted collections, dividing them first into domestic, foreign, and unidentifiable materials that were then split into separate groups according to languages. In the course of 1946, Czechoslovakia executed several restitutions, for instance to France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, and Poland. The cases were resolved according to the territorial principle, which means that the collections transferred to particular states included both Jewish and non-Jewish materials. When the representative of the Prague Jewish community arrived in the castle in autumn 1946, the transports were already on their way, and I quote, "While at Mimon, I witnessed at first hand how the Polish government, which made haste to claim the books of Polish origin, on November 11th dispatched trucks to be loaded with the Polish books, and before my eyes the books of the library of the Great Synagogue of Warsaw, Tłumaczkie, were transferred to a truck, packed up, and taken to the train station to be transported to Warsaw." Last but not least, simultaneously to the transfers abroad, there was a constant stream of domestic book circulations between the places of their discovery, then temporary magazines and depots, and finally the destination institutions, which for the Jewish book collections were primarily the Jewish Museum and the National Library in Prague. In the new places, the books were restocked and slowly incorporated into existing collections, of course with the exception of those that had been already returned, smuggled, or sold. Importantly, this internal movement of books and rather standard practices of librarianship like restocking, catalogization, exerted no lesser impact on the Nazi-looted libraries, whose provenance was often blurred and even lost during this process. In many cases, arranging books into a new order led to a further dismantling of the original collections and the loss of some crucial pieces of information regarding their previous owners, users, donors. On the one hand, it did contribute to their preservation, but on the other, it often fostered further erasure of both pre-war and wartime history of the collections. Consequently, even though the books survived physically, the collections, together with their specific historical context, had been in fact lost, and their significance reduced only to monetary value. And against this backdrop, it acquired symbolic meaning that many of the looted Jewish books incorporated in the immediate post-war years in the collections of the National Library and the Jewish Museum in Prague were later sold by weight. And one thought for the end. To sum up, nationalization is, of course, one of the major property practices performed in Eastern Europe in the late 40s. However, as I sought to demonstrate in my paper, it is not the only nor the most important one. Quite the opposite. The fate of the Nazi-looted Jewish libraries was shaped mainly during the immediate post-war years by both foreign and domestic book transfers. The prolonged legal abeyance in which the libraries were held in this period is probably the most important characteristic of the legal status in the post-war Czechoslovakia. As we have seen, this abeyance proved to be a two-edged sword. While some could not manage to find their way in a labyrinth of contradictory regulations, others, such as Joint or the Hebrew University, used the same legal uncertainty to acquire the books while depending on the arbitrary decisions made by officials or acting in semi-legal ways. And for the current provenance research on the Jewish cultural property in Eastern Europe, precisely these gray areas seem the most important. Thank you for your attention.